Okay, so just to give an overview, today's lecture is about strategy and weighing. And what those two words mean in this context. Weighing, we've mentioned before. It's kind of like comparing different arguments, saying how even if both arguments are true, yours is better, things along those lines. And I'll go more into how you should do that. Strategy is probably something you haven't thought much about yet, but it's how you should be looking at the debate as a whole. Strategy is basically what's your big game plan? How are you going to win the debate? So, not getting stuck in the details, but seeing the big picture. Okay? So, strategy is quite important. So, if you can get strategy down properly, that's like significantly going to improve your speeches. But okay, let's get into it. So, a few things. I'll first go over the strategy for the top half, or the first two teams, opening teams, then the closing teams, then explaining how strategy really works, and then finally some way. Okay. So, top half. So, opening government and opening opposition. The strategy is going to be quite similar for both of these teams, and so I'll do them together. As you might expect, the main goal is just to give lots of arguments. And this is especially important because if you think about opening government, in total there are 8 speeches. But opening government after the first 3 speeches in the debate, they're already done, right? They can't, other than POIs, their contributions to the debate are going to be pretty minimal after that point. So you're less than halfway through the debate, and you basically can't contribute anything more. So you have to be quite sensible with how you're going to spend your time. And the best way to make sure that after 5 more speeches where you haven't said anything, the judge still remembers you and still thinks you were the best team is to say lots of arguments and most likely to say the most obvious arguments as well. So if you say lots of arguments, then what that's likely to do is even if all of the opposition team tries rebutting your arguments, hopefully there's still maybe one that's left at the end that's still strong or that's unrebutted, something along those lines. If you only give like 2 arguments in total, then most likely they'll be discussed about quite a lot and they'll be defeated by the end of the debate. And so you won't have a lot of like arguments standing after 8 speeches are done. So that's your main goal. The best way to make sure you achieve this is firstly adding lots of mechanisms, adding lots of like analysis and reasoning, which I talked about before in kind of like creating arguments. It's that like main layer that proves why your arguments are true. And if you have multiple reasons why each argument is true, then even if people try attacking the argument, it's going to be very like believable and the judge will still credit it. The the other like most important thing you have to do is address the core of the debate. A lot of the time, a debate is multifaceted. There are going to be lots of things you can discuss, but only one thing which should be discussed. Or only one thing that like is more important than all the others. And so, since you don't have a lot of time, and since there are going to be lots of other teams that can focus on like the less relevant bits of the debate, your goal in the opening team is to make sure you address the most important bit. And then it's kind of like the closing team's responsibility to like focus on like the less relevant points, but explain why maybe they're just as relevant. And so kind of not only do you have to do this, but in order to do this, you have to identify what is the heart of the debate. And that can be difficult. It's not always obvious. And from some speeches I've seen this week, it's definitely very easy to get sidetracked and forget what the debate's all about. So, for example, if the debate was about like legalizing drugs, or like, legalizing marijuana, something along those lines, then theoretically someone could give an argument about how pharmaceutical companies will benefit and the economy will benefit since they're allowed to sell marijuana now or sell drugs. And there's a lot of money to be made there. So that could be an argument. And sure, like people can say that, but that's more of a closing team argument. That's not what the core or the heart of the debate's about. What the opening teams should be focusing on is things like drug addiction. Which side gets like fewer addicts? And on which side is it easier to like prevent or solve an addiction? That's what the core of the debate is. And so if you focus too much about on like the less relevant points, then your arguments aren't going to last until the end. And finally, POIs wise, you can engage with opening opposition if you're opening government, just like through your speeches. And there's like no way to engage with closing government because they're after you, like, oh well. But what you should be doing is asking POIs to the closing opposition team, which we call the team that's at your diagonal. Because if you imagine it like a square with opening government in one like corner, then closing opposition would most likely be in the other corner of the square. Hopefully that makes sense. You can probably see how they're like the teams which are furthest apart from each other. And so if you want to engage with them, the only way you can do so is with the POI. Any questions? Yes, Byro?
So just one clarification. I think I asked this before also, but can one person only use one POI during a speech?
No, so there's no limit, but I've seen in like this week people have probably been asking too many POIs and taking too many POIs. So as a rule, probably don't ask like more than twice in someone's speech and don't take more than two more than two POIs in a speech. Um, but
Thank
I guess what I'm really focusing on here is like the I mean, of course you can just like ask everyone a POI, but like that's that's probably not the best way to go about things. So I'd say keep them limited, but use them strategically. Malola?
Yeah, can you just explain the strategies to stay relevant
Okay,
again?
yeah. So first one is having lots of mechanisms and analysis for each argument. So in other words, your argument is going to have a headline, which is going to be something like, oh, uh, legalizing drugs is a bad thing because it will lead to lots of like new drug addicts, right? People who didn't take drugs before will now take drugs. So that's your headline. Now, you would have lots of mechanisms under that, such as, firstly, why is it very easy to get into drugs if it's legal? And like the contrast of if it's illegal, then why is it very difficult? So if we make that change, why will a lot of people like switch over just because of that change? So that could be like one reason. The second reason might be if you start taking drugs or if you take a few drugs, why is it likely that you like start taking a lot more and you actually become addicted? So that could be another like logical step as you go from like taking a few to taking a lot. And the third might be after you're addicted, why is it really hard to get out of your addiction? And like, why is it really difficult to solve? So that might further show how bad of a harm it is. So those are like three different things that are like quite separate from each other, but all of them make your argument stronger. So if you have lots of these like reasons and analysis, that means that even if other people attack your arguments, by the end of the debate, hopefully some reasons are still like standing and still very solid. And so the judge will be able to credit your argument as a whole because of them. Does that make sense? Okay. Ayush? No?
Yes.
Yeah. Cool.
Could you give an example for like explaining why your arguments address the heart of the debate?
Yeah, sure. Um, so I gave the drug example, but like I can give another example as well. So what's a debate we've done recently? We did things about how, so the older group, for example, did a debate about how university students might be forced to work in the public sector for some time before they're allowed to do the job they want. So something which wouldn't address the heart of the debate might be saying that, oh, like companies, um, they really care about getting university students, and the like 6 months or a year which they're not allowed to hire, that's going to like annoy them a lot. But like that's not like the core of the debate. What the debate's actually about is most likely the university students themselves and saying that, oh, either their job prospects are being significantly harmed and like they're losing all their skills. Or on the other hand, you could be saying, oh, this really benefits university students because it gives them a stable job for 6 months or a year, and this can help them pay off their student debt or something along those lines. So the core of the debate is probably focusing on the university students. And while stakeholders is important and you should like talk about those other stakeholders as well, you always want to like know in your mind that one like stakeholder is probably the most important one, and so I should be focusing on them. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So now moving on to the back half, closing government, closing opposition. Now here, this is really important because I think the top half is like relatively intuitive. You're probably like doing those kinds of things already, but the closing teams, their strategy is not intuitive at all. So the most important thing is choosing the right extension. So we talked about extensions previously. It's what are you adding to the debate which hasn't been said by your opening team? And most of the time, you'll only have like one really good extension or like two decent extensions. You're not going to be saying like five different arguments because that's what the opening teams already did. And so like there aren't that many arguments to go around. After they've said most of them, you probably only have one or two good arguments left to be said. And so first of all, you need to choose what a good extension is. But secondly, you also need to make sure you don't just say the extension or the argument in the same way you would have if you were an opening team, which is just like kind of like giving the argument itself. Instead, what you need to show is why did you choose this extension and how does it fill, like, how does it solve an issue that previously existed in the debate? So, like, maybe opening government and opening opposition were like discussing a topic which you are now resolving. So that would be explaining why your argument is really important and wins you the debate. Or it could just be like really pinning down that, oh, this is an argument that no one's talked about, but it's so, so important because it affects like this person, which we should really care about. So that's like the main goal. Before moving on, Malola?
Yeah, so basically an extension is an argument, right?
Most of the time, yes. However, if there are no like good arguments still left to be said, a rebuttal can also act as an extension. So if you can't think of any arguments, you can like just think of some like very good rebuttal that focuses on the opposition's strongest point, and that can also act as an extension. But most of the time, yes, it will be a new argument. Okay, so a bit more into the details here. Uh, it all comes down to explaining why is there something wrong with your opening team? Like, yes, they're on the same side as you, but there's something they're missing, and you need to point out why is it that like their current arguments just isn't enough. And then you explain you uniquely kind of fill that gap. So a lot of the time, this could even just be like, oh, they've said this argument, but they forgot that they need to prove like something before the argument makes sense. And so you come in, prove the like kind of starting point, and then say, oh, if we didn't have this starting point that I just proved to you, then their argument doesn't make sense at all. And so maybe the argument should be credited to me. Something along those lines. And that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to solve something that was wrong with your opening team's argumentation. And the last thing you should do is basically act like a judge. Think about who is winning the debate, who is losing, and act based on that. So you should be very adaptable. You should be changing your arguments and your strategy based on who's winning the debate. So if your opening team is winning, if your closing government and opening government is winning, then they've probably taken a lot of like the good arguments, and so maybe you should focus on rebuttal because the opposition teams are weaker and they're likely going to be easier to beat. So a lot of the time, what this means is you should just like kind of forget about the team that's obviously going to win because they're just like so far ahead, and instead try aiming for second place by beating teams who could be like third or fourth instead, right? So this is also what strategy is about. It's knowing when you should stop trying to win and go for second place instead. Because there are 4 teams, so coming first or second, both of them are like pretty good places to be in. And so that's like the other bit of it. And on the other hand, if your opening team is losing, then that's where everything else comes in about like filling in the gap and showing why are they losing, how do we make sure we don't lose in the same way. Cool. Finally now is explaining strategic implications. And there are kind of these 2 main questions that you should be thinking about when you consider what arguments are you going to deliver. The first one is why are you presenting your argument? Like why did you choose that one? Why is it so important? And like another bit of this is just like really clarifying both to other teams and the judge what your argument's trying to say. So a lot of the time, the argument's very clear in your head, but it's not going to be as clear to other people, which means other teams can misunderstand or they can even deliberately misconstrue your argument in order to make it easier to respond to. And that's not going to be possible if you're very clear about what your argument's trying to achieve. Similarly, the judge might be like interpreting the debate in a different way to you, and so they might also misunderstand your argument. So for all of these things, it's all just about clarity, right? Just like making sure everyone understands what are you trying to say. The second bit here is about interactions. So first is just about your own argument, making that very clear. The second is explaining how does your argument interact with other arguments. And in terms of like strategic implications, what this is usually trying to do is explain that, oh, I've given this argument deliberately because it clashes with this other argument that the opposition said in their first speech, or it could even be I'm giving this argument because I know that the opposition is probably going to give this opposing argument, and so I'm responding to it before they even give their argument. Something along those lines. It's about the interaction. And I think this maybe makes sense best with an example. So let's say the debate was about requiring couples to share paid parental leave equally. In other words, what that means is when you have a child, you get parental leave and you're allowed to like stop working for some period of time, let's say a few months, and take care of your child instead. And most likely the problem that this motion is trying to solve would be that maybe women are taking parental leave more often than men, and that's a bad thing because it should be more equal and like the burden of child rearing should be placed on both parents. Things along those lines. And so what opposition is likely going to say is, oh, you shouldn't force couples to do this because it's going to be suboptimal. That maybe one parent wants to take care of the children, and so there's no point in like forcing both parents to take care of the child for equal periods of time. They could also say that maybe it's just a suboptimal decision, like the parents know best of like maybe who's getting paid more, and that's a factor that goes into it, or just about like who is better suited to be raising children. There are a lot of factors which maybe the parents have more knowledge over and that they can use to make a better decision instead of forcing them to split it 50-50. However, on-site proposition, if you already know that they're going to say these points on opposition, you can respond to it preemptively by saying, wait, we understand those points, and like opposition is going to come up and say them, but on the other hand, the reason why we force a 50-50 split is because of like the other coercive measures put on parents, which means that they are going to make suboptimal decisions even if they are given the choice. So for example, culturally, maybe women are put as like the parent that should be taking care of the child more often. So that might be a factor as to like unfairly putting them in that position. Or you could also talk about how quite often there's a wage gap, which means that it makes sense for the man to be like continuing to go to work and like trying to get promoted because that'll help make the family more financially stable. So what that means is there are a lot of like other reasons, like there could be religious reasons as well, that like religious people trying to force women to take on that role of responsibility. So lots of things, which means women are coerced into taking care of the child more often than men are, which means that these parents are actually making suboptimal decisions. And so if we force them to do a 50-50, they'd be better off like that. Okay, I think that was a bit of a complicated example, but any questions on the example or strategic implications? Okay, so then the last bit is weighing. And you've probably heard this a bit, but weighing is just about explaining why is an argument important and why is it more important than other arguments. And the reason why we use weighing is quite often it's difficult to rebut an argument. It's hard to say that it's like just wrong. And so what you're trying to do is just explain, okay, the argument's correct, but it's not important or it's worse than our argument. And the other reason why you might weigh is to explain why you win the debate as a whole. So weighing is quite important for the closing teams and for the last speaker specifically, because their responsibility, since they're not allowed to say new arguments, is to explain, is just to kind of like compare arguments and compare teams to say why you win. And that comes down to weighing. And so this is the last bit. How do you weigh exactly? There are 5 different ways. Like this is just examples. There are like more ways, but these are like the 5 most common ways. And let's see if we can make this slightly more interactive. Could someone tell me an example of maybe 2 arguments for opposite sides which affect different numbers of people? So the first weighing metric is about the number of individuals. And so basically saying my argument affects more people than your argument, and that's why it's more important. Does anyone remember any arguments that like could fall under this category of being important because they affect a lot of people? Agastya? Or
So if there's an argument that like if there's an argument like let's just say there's an argument that people with diseases should be like more taken care of than people who are dying. Because people who are dying are gonna like die soon, so there's no point saving. So the government would say that yes, this would save in a hospital, this would save like 10 people that with diseases. But then the opposition could say that yeah, this is saving 10 people who are dying, and therefore people who are dying are a bit more important than people who have diseases.
Okay, so the point you said makes sense. I would say that falls more under the intensity of impact, which I'll go into, but that's also a great point. Aditya, do you have anything on like number of individuals?
So I'll remember like a couple days ago we were doing this debate about whether university students after university should go straight on to like a job in the public sector. And so the number of individuals would be like the people who are graduating from the university in a given year. Does that
Yeah. So, if you like sufficiently explain how this is like such a large number of people, there are like millions of university graduates, and maybe the other side is giving an argument about how like the teachers at universities are okay. Yeah, theoretically, let's say it's like university professors, then you can say your argument's more important because there are more university graduates than there are university professors. Sure, that's one way to go about it. Cool. So that's like the first one, right? Just saying your argument affects more people, and so it's more important. The second one is kind of what Agastya just mentioned about like if you help someone who's about to die versus you help someone who just has like a non-fatal disease. Because it comes down to who are you helping more or who are you harming more. So it's the same number of people, maybe it's 10 people on both sides, but if you save a life, then that's a much greater impact compared to if you like alleviate a disease. So that's number two. The third one is the importance of stakeholders. Could someone give me an example here of so stakeholders are different groups of people, and sometimes that depends on the motion, but like there are some broader stakeholders. Yeah, Ayush?
So, for example, if the motion was about whether we should relieve student loans and student debt, then the stakeholders could be the students who have graduated and their debt is going to be relieved, the government, which is going to have to pay for all of this, and the taxpayer, who is going to have to pay for the government, who is going to have to pay for all of this. So while there are far more taxpayers than students in general, so you can say number of individuals we should not relieve the debt. By intensity of impact, you could argue that these debts are so huge, they're impacting the students stable, they're very predatory loans, and so by intensity of impact, we should make the taxpayer relieve the student loans and student debts.
Yeah, so that's a great point. That's basically what I'm looking for. In that scenario, students are like the most important stakeholder because of how they're young, they're vulnerable, they don't have a lot of money, they like barely have a job. And so in that case, helping them is more important than helping the average taxpayer, because the average taxpayer is probably better off than like a student who hasn't gotten a job yet. So that's number three. Hopefully that makes sense. It's just about different groups of people and which ones we care about more. Okay, fourth is marginal utility. Maybe you've heard the phrase before. What it means is if you give $100 to someone who's homeless, then that would help them a lot. On the other hand, if you give $100 to a billionaire, then it's not going to help them very much. They don't really care. And so depending on how much you already have, the same amount has a bigger difference. So if you have very little, then $100 does a lot for you. If you have a lot, it doesn't do much. And an example of like where this might come into play is if, for example, let's say you had academic professors and you were deciding which country should they go teach in. If they go teach in the US, then there's like very little utility from that because there are already like thousands of university professors there who like have like wonderful credentials. On the other hand, if you go teach in a developing country, maybe if you go teach in Asia or Africa, then that's going to make a much bigger difference because there are very few like high quality university professors there compared to the US. And so you as an individual would be making a much bigger impact on people's lives. So that's where marginal utility comes in. Malola?
So taking yesterday's example, so suppose you suspend trading of a small country with the colonizer, it won't make a big impact. But if you suspend trading with a big country and the colonizer, or the colonized country is a bigger country, then it will make a big impact.
Yes, so exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Uh, you're like the amount of trade being stopped is the same for both sides because it's like a two-way kind of relationship, but it affects the smaller country more because of marginal utility, because they benefit a lot. They used to benefit a lot more from that trade. The UK or some other big country, they don't care because marginal utility-wise is like a smaller bit. Okay, last bit, end of the lecture is about probability. And what this means is, let's say the opposition's given like very big impacts, like it affects millions of people, it like could lead to thousands of deaths, and like these are the most vulnerable people. Um, but the problem is their argument is very unlikely. It's just not like compared, it's just like a very far-fetched scenario. Uh, and so even if your argument like only affects like 20, like, I don't know, like 100 people and not to as much of an extent, if you can say that it will happen with 100% certainty, then you could try explaining why it's a better argument. Abir?
I didn't quite understand importance of stakeholder. Can you explain it once more, please?
Importance of stakeholder, sure. I'll go into that right at the end. First, I'll just finish off probability. So, probability-wise, a quick example would be in the debate yesterday about like cutting off trade. Someone could argue that like, oh, the country sees that as a very aggressive act and like wages war on the like previously colonized like smaller country. Like that would be a really bad harm, right? Like you literally have the UK, I don't know, waging war on some of its previous colonies. Lots of people would die if that actually happened. But you can say like, oh wait, that's like very unlikely. Like why would they do that? Like that makes no sense because of various reasons of like all the other like really big countries would stop the UK or they'd think the UK is like reacting unfairly. So there are lots of reasons why the UK wouldn't do that, which makes it very unlikely. And so even if your argument is like much smaller impact compared to like waging war and all the harms that come with it, you can still win by explaining how it's more likely. Okay, and finally back to importance of stakeholder. Basically, it's like you compare two groups. Like let's say the poor versus the rich, and you're saying, oh, we should help the poor because they are the poor and like we care more about them. Or it could be students versus like the average taxpayer, where students are a more vulnerable group because they don't have a job yet and like have a lot of student debt weighing them down. It could be like children versus adults. Like children are a more important stakeholder, and that's why, for example, like when a ship is sinking, it's always children first, right? Because innately they are more important as stakeholders. Does that make sense?